Lincoln refuses, and he's famous for this, he refuses to accept the presence of that institution as evidence that he's wrong about the nation's dedication to equality. Slavery existed, yes, he admits that, but it was an inheritance for what he would call the pre-nation. You know, the pre-nation. We inherited it. We had nothing to do but have it, but nonetheless we didn't choose it. And he thinks that the fathers understood it as incompatible with their dedication to equality. And indeed, the fathers, the founders, acted in the wake of the Revolution to abolish slavery in many parts of the Union. And he insists they looked forward to the day of its fading away eventually everywhere. Perhaps, historians now think, I would partly agree with this, perhaps Lincoln overstates the fathers' view of the subject, because surely there were some for whom this was not true. That is, some who did not look forward to the fading away of slavery. But I think on the whole he is correct. On the whole he's correct. That most of the founders thought, as he said they did, that slavery was incompatible and that it would be good to be rid of it, and that indeed they could see ways in which it was fading away. And some of the largest slaveholding, some of the larger slaveholding founders certainly agreed with this. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, definitely. So slavery is a test of this dedication to equality in a very obvious way. But Lincoln, I think, has in mind also a less obvious way in which it constitutes a test. By 1863, when he gave the speech, many in America spoke out who held slavery to be a good, to be natural, to be the way civilization ought to be organized. Many spoke out who openly endorsed the opposite of the equality proposition that Lincoln cites in the first sentence. Some, including the senator from my now home state, said on the floor of the Senate that the claims raised in the Declaration of Independence were self-evident lies. Said on the floor of the Senate. Slavery, Lincoln thought, was a cancer inside the community which ate away at the consensus on all men are created equal. It showed the fragility of that consensus. Why is that consensus fragile? Well, self-interest. Self-interest opposes it. Equality, Lincoln says, is the father of all moral principle in us, and to affirm equality means to affirm the rights of all others and to accept as morally obligatory the limitations on the pursuit of our own interests that this recognition requires. We may not enslave others, even if it's to our benefit to do so. Yet, the old Adam, you know, is strong in us. It's no surprise, self-loving and self-interested beings that we are, that some of us, or even many of us, should be tempted to shuck off the demands of moral restraint contained in that proposition, that all men are created equal, I should say, and adopt instead the more self-indulgent claim of a right to hold others as slaves, if we can get away with it, as unequals without rights. The war is thus a test of whether this nation can long endure, because the war is testimony to how easily the dedication that defined the nation at its start can be forgotten or even renounced. The nation that does not retain that dedication will not long endure. Not that it will necessarily fall to a foreign invader or that it will dissolve in disorder or whatever, but by losing that dedication, it loses its identity. A nation may survive upon this continent, but it will not be the same nation. That's, I think, Lincoln's real point. Now, a second sense in which Lincoln sees the war as a test of whether this nation can long endure is the issue I've already mentioned in the context of my discussion of the first paragraph. The war was immediately provoked not by slavery, but by secession. It is a war to preserve the Union caused most immediately by the efforts of some of the states to leave the Union. Now, Lincoln, as you may know, was particularly exercised about the claimed right to secede, and he did all he could to commit the Union, to commit the nation, to employ arms against the seceders rather than to follow the advice of many, even among fellow Republican Party members. Horace Greeley, the important newspaper editor, who was an important leader of the Republican Party, said, this was his advice at the time of secession, let our erring sisters depart. James Buchanan, who was Lincoln's predecessor as president, not a Republican but a Democrat, had an idea somewhat similar to Greeley's. He thought that secession was illegal, but he thought he also had no power, and would exercise none to prevent it. And he lived up to his thoughts on that. This was not Lincoln's policy. He accepted or indeed courted war in order to prevent those erring sisters from departing the Union. Now, why did Lincoln do everything in his power to ensure a fratricidal war? I mean, a war that still, no war in American history has come close to the number of casualties that this war produced. Why did he do everything in his power to ensure this fratricidal war rather than to accept separation? Now, that was a question Lincoln spoke to at some length in his two most important addresses prior to the Gettysburg, two most important presidential addresses prior to the Gettysburg Address. In his speech of July 4th, 1861, addressed to Congress in special session, symbolically called for July 4th, you know, Lincoln. In this speech, Lincoln used language so clearly resembling that of the Gettysburg Address that we can be certain that in his earlier and longer speech, he's pursuing some of the same themes as he did at Gettysburg. Here's what he says on July 4th, 1861. The action by the government to resist efforts at disunion embraces more than the fate of the United States. It presents to the whole family of man the question whether a constitutional republic or democracy, a government of the people, by the same people, can or cannot maintain its integrity against its own domestic foes. It presents the question whether discontented individuals, too few in numbers to control the administration, according to the law, can, upon the pretenses made in this case, or any other pretenses, or arbitrarily, without any pretense, break up the government, and thus practically put an end to free government upon the earth. Now, in this speech, as in all of his earlier speeches, Lincoln insisted on a great difference between secession and rebellion. Secession and rebellion, two very different things. He never denied the existence of an abstract right of revolution. But this was a right affirmed in the Declaration of Independence. This was a right which, according to the Declaration of Independence, could only be rightly exercised when government became destructive of the ends for which it had been instituted. But Lincoln argued no such case could be made here. Unlike the British in the 1770s, the United States government had, at the time of secession, violated no constitutional or natural rights, had not declared the southern states outside the protection of the laws, and had not made war on them. Of course, as you may know if you've studied any of this political theory, according to the theory of the Declaration, those who lay claim to the right of revolution must, in the final analysis, judge for themselves whether their rights are endangered or not. There is finally no common judge between the government and the aggrieved parties. The solution in such a case is, in the language of John Locke, the philosopher who developed this theory most decisively, the solution, Locke said, was a, quote, appeal to heaven, by which he quaintly meant war, revolution, appeal to arms. If the government is genuinely threatening to the rights of its people, then there may well be sufficient support to overthrow it. But not every whiff of discontent is legitimate ground for revolution, and the government rightly may continue to enforce its laws and to resist any armed resistance. The right of revolution doesn't just give anybody the right to pick up arms any time and start shooting government officers. Lincoln could accept the Southern action as a misguided and unjustified exercise of their revolutionary right, but then his resistance to that act is also perfectly legitimate and justified. But, and here's the key point, the Southerners were not claiming to be exercising a revolutionary right. They claimed instead a right to secede, that is, a right to leave the Union peacefully as they had entered it. The government of the Union, according to the theory of secession, had no right to resist their decision to leave the Union. So one thing at stake in this apparently abstract and very legalistic argument that arose at the time over the legitimacy of secession, the theory of secession, was whether the North had a right to respond militarily to the South's action. If the South were correct in their theory of secession, then Lincoln had no right to marshal armies against them. That was what was at stake there. Now, Lincoln had a whole array of arguments against the Southern argument about secession. I'm going to just mention the most important of them to you, however.